Welcome to the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast, where we have real conversations about all things homeschooling from a Canadian perspective. I'm your host, Lisa Marie, and in this episode, I'll be talking about how to teach to your child's learning styles with our special guest, Diane Geerlinks from Geerlinks Educational Therapy. So grab your favorite drink and come join us on the couch. So thanks so much for joining me, Diane. I'm excited to chat with you about learning and, all those things homeschooling that we like to chat about. So thanks so much for joining me.
You are welcome. It's always exciting to talk to you and to share ideas together.
Cool. All right. So I thought maybe we could start things off if you just want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your program that you run and your services that you provide.
Sure. My name's Diane Geerlinks, and I've homeschooled for, 25 or so years. And then I trained to be an educational therapist. And so now I have my own practice called Geerlinks Educational Therapy, and I work with homeschooled and schooled students. And I have 5 therapists that work with me. So we get to support families as they support their unique learners, is how I call it. So it's wonderful.
What inspired you to start helping people and families with learning challenges?
Yeah, that's interesting, because when you're in the thick of it at homeschooling, you just think, I can't wait till I'm done. I mean, because you love it, but you just can't believe that never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd work with other people's children. But my own child struggled and learned differently. And of course, a few of them, we had 5 children. And so we still have 5 children, thankfully. But yeah, they learned differently. And one in particular struggled more. And so I was like, what's going on and how can I support him? And as I learned more about that, it just totally inspired me to say, there's so many other people that, parents especially, that are walking this journey, and what can I do to help them? So it is my passion to support homeschool parents for sure.
Yeah, and I appreciate that as a mom who's got kids with various learning challenges. I know we've talked a few times about the struggles that I've had, and I know I've asked you some advice, and you've been very patient and thoughtful in your answers. So I appreciate that. So,
well, you're welcome. And I think that's just what we need. And so often as I consult with parents, I'll say to them, you're the mom and you know your kid best. So help me understand what is happening and what you're noticing. And even just this morning, I had a mom who said, well, I just want to know how we can parent better. Like, it's probably me. And I'm thinking, it's probably not you. It's probably a child that is, experiencing, whether it's stress or a different way of learning. And so how can we together figure it out? And I think that's mostly my passion, is working with parents to say, well, here's an idea. Would this maybe work?
That's awesome. Yeah. And I know that it's helpful because I think homeschoolers in general, especially homeschool moms, we put so much pressure on ourselves to do it all right, to make sure we haven't messed up our kids, that we immediately jump to it being us.
Totally. As did I. It's my fault. I just had too many children. That was my whole thought was, well, 5 children, everybody's right. 5 children is too many. And so your 5th child, you just ignored, and therefore he's struggling. Well, it turned out that it wasn't that at all.
Yeah.
Which actually, kind of leads into the topic, because, when I finally got him diagnosed and, learned that it was auditory processing disorder, well, then everything kind of felt, came together with, that all makes sense now. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that really helped me understand, like, man, had I known this would have been helpful back when. As I muddled through. I mean, because we muddle through. We find ways, and I think sometimes as parents, we fall upon ways that work. And you, like, why'd you do that? I don't know. I just fell upon it. But this is the way I had to make this happen for this child. And that's the beauty of parenting and homeschooling.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about that then. When we talk about learning, is one of the first steps that a lot of times, and I've said it myself too, is understanding how your child learns best. And I know that there's this common discussion about learning styles. So could you just take a minute and kind of explain what learning styles, whether that's in quotations or reality, and talk about what that is?
Yeah. So The way we learn things, it comes in three different ways. Learning occurs in how we take in information, how we process that information, and then how we call it the output, how we then can share that information. So when you're learning something new, you're taking it in. Anybody listening to this podcast now is listening using their auditory pathway to be able to hear the information and take it in, and probably processing at the same time, right? You hear it. It's not just information, you're processing it, you're relating it to yourself. The output comes when you're sitting down in the evening and you have a conversation with your spouse about it or a friend. And so then you are outputting. So when you come to learning styles, you have to think about, how does my child take in information best? If you had to learn something right now in a flash, what would be the best way to learn this information? The common ones we hear about are auditory or visual or kinesthetic. And so those have been around for a bunch of years. I mean, earlier than that, we had this whole idea of left brain, right brain, and which side of the brain do you mostly use, and it that was part of the science behind figuring that out. I think now we've moved away from that to say it's not quite as simple as, well, I just use, because hopefully you're using both sides of your brain. Right? And there's front to back, and there's the inside of the brain, which is where the amygdala's anxiety piece or the emotional piece. So there's so many parts to this learning. But when we come to learning styles, it also isn't as easy as saying, well, my kid's an auditory learner, or my kid's a visual learner, or my kid's a kinesthetic learner. However, likely there is a preference to one or another. And so that, I think, is helpful to say, how else can I teach this to this child? And if I need them to understand this, which method should I use? What curriculum should I use? And so as we look at our students and our kiddos, and we look at, okay, so let me just do a little survey here, a little checklist to say, what is their prime or their best way to learn something new? And I think we all have an idea of our own selves even. We can go back to, oh man, I got to do it, I got to read it, I got to see it. Whereas others, some people can read it in a book and they'll remember it forever, right? They see it, they see the words, they've read it, they come in, no problem. Other people can hear a podcast and word for word tell back what they heard. And other people, say, actually, I'm a mix of both and all.
When I was in school, I know when I used to do tests at the end, when you did a test, and that's where you pull your recall of the information.
Exactly.
Right? So the way I would do things would be, I never studied for tests, because how I remembered things was watching myself write notes. I could watch myself write the notes in my memory. So,
and maybe you had a picture even of where that was written on your page. So sometimes people can recall which page it's on. They drew a little picture in the margin and there was an apple there, and the apple has nothing to do with the memory of the content, but I know that that's on that page. And so there is that visual ability. You come up with a system that's going to work for you.
So podcasts for me, although I enjoy doing them, I can't listen to them because I don't hear a sound. It's just noise. I don't hear. I have to very clearly force myself to focus, like close my eyes or take notes. Or it's the same thing at like webinars or church services or anything. I have to force myself to do something to intentionally focus. So audio doesn't work for me. So I know for myself that that's not how I'm going to learn best. So that's just interesting.
Right. Now, what if you pair audio with some visual? Right now, all of a sudden, you're using both gates or pathways. And if I move my hand at the same time, or I'm walking and I pull that all together, well, now I've got all three of them, and therefore I can recall it best.
I often tell people when we come to this conversation of learning styles, I call it the IKEA test. So if you brought home a chair from IKEA in the box and you said to your kid, put that together.
Yeah.
how would your kid figure out how to put that together? Would they look at the notes, the little booklet that comes with it, or watch a video online? Like, what should they do that? Would they ask you to tell them the instructions from the book, or would they just jump in and take all the pieces and try to figure it out together?
Love it. So great. It is a test. And I think it takes a while to kind of look at your child and say, so how are they going to put things together? But again, you want to think about that's output. So you want to look at, okay, if they had to memorize and now tell somebody else how to put this
Mm,
together, how are they going to learn that best? If they have made it, first of all, that's going to help, right?
hmm,
And then how are they going to tell somebody, or are they going to say, here, come here, let me show you,
right. Yeah. Good point.
right? And so you have to look at both ends of this, the information comes in, how you think about that information, and then how are you going to project that information. So for my son, who had auditory processing disorder, his strength was not auditory, obviously. And so that comes in with the input, right? So he needs a lot of visual. When we got to high school, we'd have a textbook, but we also had auditory, so we put them together so we could listen to the CD as he's looking at the textbook. But then the output piece, he's not going to verbally, it's not going to be that easy for him to express himself. So even though writing might be tricky, it verbally wasn't really better for him.
All right. So, what do you think are some common misconceptions that people have about learning styles?
I get concerned that people quickly put people into a box to
Hmm.
say, well, I'm auditory or I'm visual, or that, when the new science is showing us they don't even call them learning styles anymore. It's called learning modalities, which just means which number of ways do we learn best. And I think the reality is that I think we're not just one.
Hmm.
We are a combination. And that we need a few of these together in order to really consolidate and remember and recall. So I think that's a common misperception. I also think that we're coming out of a generation where auditory was the best way to get a lot of information into people fast. As I sit in front of a class, as I do even now when I'm doing presentations to a whole group at a conference, for instance, it's an auditory presentation because there's 50 people in the room and I can't really have them all do hands-on stuff. So it's sort of our fallback. Let me do a
Right.
lot of talking. But for people like you who say, well, that's going to be really hard. I need the PowerPoint slides. I need some story. I have to bring some story into it. I have to move around a little. I need you to get up and be able to move a bit, or at least write,
Hmm.
moving your hand in order to be able to grasp the concept. And so I think we fall back on auditory very easily, maybe because it's the easiest way to teach something quickly.
Yeah. And it's probably just also what tradition has taught us that teachers need to stand at the front and talk, right?
Exactly.
And I think it's really cool that we're seeing more information on how to help people learn better, especially those who aren't neurotypical, because
Yep.
a lot of our neurodivergent kids struggle
Yeah.
with these common ways, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I know one of my kids, I swore black and blue that he would have auditory processing disorder because we would say things like, get the cup from the top of the dishwasher and bring it to me. And he would just go to the kitchen and stare blankly for a while. And we had no idea. I'm like, all right, so 3 steps is too many. Okay. He's my but it
Yes.
but so I thought for sure he had auditory
Auditory.
issues, but he ended up being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, the inattentive version, which I know has a different
Yeah.
name now, blah blah blah, but it's
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
years since
Yeah.
it. But
Yeah.
it gave us understanding that he just couldn't pay attention enough to hear all the steps. So he would lose the steps
Right.
before, right? So
Yeah.
it's been interesting to me to see how even my own kids, the way that they learn, and they're really intuitive too. Kids are really good at understanding how they learn. When I was
Yeah.
struggling, I would just be like, all right, how do you think you're going to learn this best? How can we do math better because you're struggling with math in a workbook? Like, how can we make this better? And a lot of times they're like, I just really like watching a video because I can see somebody doing it and then I can understand how to do it. Or I really need to, the math blocks that you can get and things, like being
Yeah,
able to
yeah,
see it and try it is another way
yeah,
that one of my kids did it as well.
yeah.
And trying to read aloud books, good Lord, forget that. That was just a waste of my time. Read alouds was, I love the picture of being the nice family that's snuggled
I
on the couch
like,
reading a book. My kids would not do that. Like, there was
I
no
like
way.
the
I do. It works better with some of my
idea.
younger kids who are obviously less neurodivergent than some of
Okay.
their older ones. But my older
Yeah.
ones, I was like, reading aloud was a waste of my time because it might as well just have been going Charlie Brown, wah, 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 right?
Totally. And that's what my son actually said. When you talk, it sounds like blah, 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 blah. And I'd be
Mm.
like, great, I'm trying to teach you. Right. But for him, it was too many words. So this is what happens with when you have auditory struggles is the person starts to, so let's say I'm the teacher and I tell you something, and then you look at me with this blank look because maybe you haven't it hasn't got there yet. It's taking a little bit of processing time. And because you kind of give me this blank look, I just repeat it. Except this time I don't repeat the instruction. I say it differently because I don't think you understood me.
Right.
So now I've given you more auditory input in a different way. And now you're trying to process that auditory input, but you're still trying to process the first one. And so I think we are trying to teach when instead we could say to them, okay, so I showed you this, or we talked about this, tell me what you heard. And so
Mm.
then we have an opportunity to ask them and find out from them, what did they hear? Someone with auditory processing struggles, or when that's not their strength, visual could be, and it could be movement, and we add that to it. But if that's not their strength, you're going to need to give them think time. You're going to need to give them some time to process what was said and then tell it back.
If the general public has kind of been given this belief that everybody's got a learning style and you're either a visual, audio, or kinesthetic learner, how can that be like a really negative thing for us as parents to be putting on our kids?
I don't think it's negative. I think it's actually a positive thing. I just think that we want to not just jump to, well, you are this kind of learner.
Mm.
Instead, have them discover how they learn best. Like for you to be able to say, well, I learn best when I write. Like, let me think back. What would be my strength to be able to say, how am I going to learn this? And you can't just say, well, I'm not auditory, therefore I'm not ever going to listen to a podcast again, because that's, or it's somebody teaching me, or listen to a
Mm.
pastor at church, right? Because that's not the world. So I think the negative thing is when we box people in to say this is the only way. And I think kinesthetic is an interesting one because I do workshops on, it's all about eyes and ears, but we all learn best by movement.
Mm.
So whenever we add movement to anything, the brain connects with it. And so whether that's, talking with your hands, whether that's writing it down, whether that's doing jumping jacks while you're learning your multiplication facts, right? It's just adding another component to be able to make that learning stick. And that's what we want for our kids. We want to find a way to make this learning stick so that the recall can happen. The saying, tell me something, I'll forget it. Let me see something and I'll remember it. Let me do it and I'll really remember it. That's very true. I think when we add all three, now it's powerful.
I know you mentioned that it's not called learning styles anymore. It's called modalities. Are there more modalities than the three that we're traditionally taught about?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's like graphing and pictures and so images, which of course is still visual, but I mean, those are the main three. But we could have a music modality,
Mm.
right? Some people, so it could still be auditory, but now we've added music. And so this modality of I need to sing the song in order to remember my multiplication tables is a modality. And so it just adds to those ideas that, okay, what other ways can we learn and connect with information? I think that for a lot of our kiddos, especially when we're learning multiplication facts, that seems to be this trip up in a lot of families. Like, well, I really want my kids to, wake up in the middle of the night and know that 9 times 8 is 72. I want them to know it like this. But the reality is that's so auditory. And so if you have auditory struggles, that is really hard. What if we add a story to that so
Right.
that we can remember, right? And I know that Diane Kraft has some of those. There's Times Tales, I think, is another math program that has some story added to it. So now these kids, any of us, can connect with a story.
Yeah, my younger two love number blocks, and my kids are now 9 and 11, so they're kind of beyond the show that Number Blocks was, but they still love watching it. And I always find it fascinating because my daughter will go, "Oh, these are step numbers," and I'm like, "I have no idea what you're talking about," but she's got it in her head, and she knew math like off the bat, like even when she was young, because she'd learned from Number Blocks, which is lots of songs, lots of bright colors, total fun stories about how
Yeah.
when two sevens get together, they make Extreme 14, who likes to skateboard, right? So it's just instant connection, and she can sing the songs. Like, she's very musical. She totally gets all that. She can remember a song like right away. And so that's why when you said the music one, I'm like, that's really interesting because I can see that in my daughter. She can pick that kind of stuff up. And that's a really cool extra. I never thought about that. So that's cool.
Yeah. Well, and again, like, so what kind of learning style is she? I don't know, but what I do know is that story helps her, visual helps her, right?
Yeah.
Because it helps all of us. And
Yeah.
so do you see the conundrum of not just throwing in what this is, I have to figure out my kid's learning style, but to say, how can I teach this subject using some visual, using some auditory, using some kinesthetic, because likely all my kids are going to remember this best. And that's harder because the truth is that teaching auditorily is our fallback because
Mm.
it's so much easier to just, here, can you guys just listen to me for a minute
Yeah.
while I teach you this? That's what we want because it's the easiest. It's more work to say, okay, I got to figure out how I'm going to make this into a visual task, and I'm going to get you to jump around and crawl around the room while we're doing it.
Mm.
And we've just added hard work. However, if they caught it immediately, it would be so worth it.
I know, but it's hard when we're moms and we've got lots of kids and we're
Oh,
trying to balance all the things in our lives to make it extra special and extra crazy, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
could you please just remember this? Right, so you have to pick. You can't make everything a hands-on experience. You
Mm.
can't make everything into this amazing experiment in your home because, I mean, the reality is not every day is like this. And
Right.
so you have to choose this is really important. And
Mm.
I want to teach this once. Okay, maybe twice. Right? So what are we going to do to help learn this?
Right. So, as a homeschool mom or homeschool parent, is there anything that we can do as parents to kind of get an idea of where our kids naturally lean towards? I know that we need to do a multiple perspective of learning, but is there one way that we can see how our kids tend to learn best?
Sure, I think you have to be a really good detective,
Mm.
right? You have to really watch, like, how did they learn that? And I mean, for you to say, like, wow, how does she remember this, your
Mm.
daughter, right? And you're like, oh, she watched this on a show. Because when you're watching it on a video, right, you're getting the auditory, you're getting the visual, you're getting a story, so then you have to look at auditorily, what is this working? Can I follow my child to say, like, your example of the task of getting something, your direction?
Mm.
Can they follow your direction? And so often parents tell me, my child just doesn't listen to me. And if they would just pay attention, like, they're so smart, why can't they do this? And I have to pull them back to say, hang on a minute. Is it really disobedience? Is it really, them not wanting to listen? Or is it really that they couldn't follow your whole instruction? And so
Mm.
really paying attention to because we as moms give instructions all the time,
Yep.
right? And we have to. We're about to go out the door and they need their water bottle and their soccer shoes. And didn't you hear me say you also need your soccer socks?
Yep.
Right? And so I think that you can't expect that they're just going to catch it. Let me also say that, you have to try it out. You have to practice. You have to say, well, one day I'm going to teach, multiplication tables, while we're crawling around, and let's see how that works. Will they remember it as easily? So there's some trial and error. The other thing I wanted to address a little bit is your thoughts about ADHD and auditory processing, because they can be misdiagnosed. Because auditory processing and ADHD can look so similar, right? So is it ADHD that he couldn't pay enough? I mean, I don't know. I'm not arguing with the diagnosis as much as just thinking through, is it that he couldn't pay attention long enough to follow your instruction? Or was it too many instructions, therefore he tuned out? And maybe it's a bit of both. Sometimes auditory processing is missed in that way. The other way to really look at auditory processing is when we're teaching the phonetics and teaching reading, right? That's often where they do not hear the difference between and and eh. It's such a fine difference. And so I would say to my child, like, like cat, and he'd put an I, and I'd say, no, it's and he'd say, that's what I put. This reality that what they hear is different than what you've said. And that's sort of one of the ways I think you can really listen and look at, or words, so many kids will get their words mixed up, right? And so somebody will say cough and they heard caught.
Right.
Right. And so just those words, like, what did they hear? And so you're asking them to tell you back, what did you hear? That helps you kind of say, oh, they auditorily have not followed it.
I love the visualization of you be your kid's detective. Be a detective.
Yeah.
Observe everything. And a lot of times I think it's really important for us to also observe them in a non-intentional setting, especially when they're just playing or they're just doing things for fun themselves, because then you can see them in their natural setting instead of being forced to try and make themselves learn how they think you want them to learn, right? And they're not masking the challenges that they're having. If they're just playing with friends, like, what are they doing the most? Like, what are they naturally inclined? Or if they're older and they're not little kids anymore, how do they find their own information? So they're stuck in a video game. How do they problem solve that? Right?
Oh, yeah.
My kids it's amazing to me how resourceful my children will be about video games when they want to solve a problem, as opposed to go research the pyramids for me and provide me with an essay. But they could provide me an essay with the solution to the problem they're having in a video game that they've researched themselves or talked to somebody about or whatever they need to do, right? It's amazing watching them when they're not under the guise of school.
Totally. And I think our natural, let's have our student research often is, here's a pile of books from the library, do some research, right? Even though we ourselves are Googling constantly.
That's true.
Right? Research comes in many different ways. And so your kiddos are researching their video game problem solving.
Yep.
Right? It's research, it's trial and error. It's, here, let's try this. This doesn't work, so let's try this. It's research that comes together.
All right. So do you have any practical steps that we can do to kind of help support our kids' learning and making sure that we've included a variety of different modalities for our kids to be successful in learning?
Yeah, so let's look at some of the visual, because I think it's easy for us. We fall back on the auditory. So how do we visually help, and maybe even adding movement to help our students learn things visually, right? They need the charts and the diagrams and the color, right? So what if, like, I remember, teaching multiplication facts and making cards and putting them around the house, let's say 6 times 4, and 6 is pink and 4 is blue, and we put 24, and we put the 24 on the front of the card. So we have these little index cards around the house with this visualization of 6 times 4 equals 24 in different colors. For our visual learners, they can't help but notice. Our auditory is like, just tell me 6 times 4 is 24, and they got it. But our visual will take it, they can't help but see, and it is now in their mind. So when they see a 6 and a 4 on a paper with an X in between, they know the answer is 24 because they have seen it and they've taken a picture. So when we think about our visual learners, they take pictures of things in their mind all the time. So they know where something is because they saw the picture of it. Now you can train them in that too. You can help them recognize or find. But adding color, I think, is a big piece to that, right? So it's not a black and white page. It's not a page. Our visual learners, may get distracted by all the color on a page. And so we might want to take some of that away because they're looking at all the stories and all the little cute cartoons on the page, right? So sometimes I think what I'm saying is that sometimes that visual strength can be a distraction.
I can see that too. Yep.
Just like the auditory strength can be a distraction. And so your auditory learner, if that's their strength, they can't work in the same room as the child who's playing with Lego as they're rummaging through the box, because there's too much auditory noise for them to learn how to tune that out, which tells us that the strength can also be a weakness sometimes.
That's true. Mm.
And you want to be able to look at that strength. So if they're a visual learner, too much color is going to be like, there's just too much going on. I don't even know where to look. Another teaching strategy, I think, is this detective moment, is look for these aha moments where all of a sudden you see your child learn something new and you're like, how did they just learn that? Right? Because our kids learn in spite of us. We don't teach them everything. In fact, they learn most things without us.
And often they learn the things we don't want them to learn. So, yeah.
So looking for those moments when you're like, how did they learn that? How did you learn this? Oh, I read it in a book somewhere. Well, that's your clue. Was this a picture book? Was this an auditory book? Oh, I heard that. I heard you guys talking about it, when we were visiting so-and-so. Oh, that's pretty auditory, right? So those kind of aha moments, I think. Maybe even in multiplication, here's another example. You might want to look up those multiplication charts where, again, we're using color and we can, do the x-axis and the y-axis and find 6 times 4 and see the patterns. So seeing things in patterns really helps our visual learner. Sometimes you can listen for their words because this is simplified, but it is true that sometimes you hear them say, like, I didn't hear you, right? Or now I see, right? So there's this, you can listen for how they have their aha moments. Are they a visual? Are they more visual? Are they more auditory? I mean, one of my kids, like, whenever they told a story of what happened, we got all the details of everything, what color this traffic light was when we were at it. That didn't have anything to do with the story, but all the pieces that come together, right? They're so visual, they can't turn out everything to focus in on what I need to focus in on.
That's interesting.
And I think that this auditory and visual then also comes into play a little bit in the area of reading, which I talked about already. So sometimes, this is where, back to your question of, is it a disadvantage? Sometimes there'll be this person that comes to talk to me about dyslexia and that struggle with learning to read. And they'll say, well, my kid's a visual learner. And so, we just have to give them sight words. And sight words are important because there's lots of words that we learn that don't have a pattern. For instance, right? There's lots of words that's just a word and we have to memorize it and it becomes a sight word. But it also is not okay to only use the visual to help them have this bank of words that they've now visually memorized. Because we also want to give them the tools auditorily to be able to decode a word that they find in their reading. And so they need both, and we can't just have one. Well, and I've heard parents say this, well, I know they're dyslexic and they're very visual, so I'm just going to give them this. And it's like, well, that's part of the story, and that's helpful. Yes. We just don't want to just do that.
Right. I've seen that in schools too, right? Where they've had the concept for a long time that, okay, we're just doing phonics. Like that's all we're focusing on. And then they swing over to whole language learning where they're just going to
Ugh,
teach all the words. And then they swing back the other way because things aren't working. It's like if you
ugh.
could just find a happy medium in the middle,
We
kids
need
would
both.
learn. Yes, right? So
Yeah.
one of my boys really, really struggled with reading. And it wasn't that I thought he was dyslexic. He just couldn't seem to grasp the concept of phonics, like no matter how
Okay.
hard I tried.
Yeah.
I remember when he would read, he would guess words based on the shape of them as opposed to the
Oh,
sound of them. So he might be able to figure out the first sound and then he would guesstimate the rest of the words. You're like,
yeah,
how
yeah.
did you come up with that random word? But it was a similar length word, a similar kind of starting sound. It wasn't until I often shipped my kids off to my mom for reading learning because she's a
Maybe
special.
she could figure it out. Yep.
Yep. And I don't think using outside resources is a bad thing as a parent when your kid is struggling, because sometimes kids can learn better from somebody else because they teach it in a way that makes different sense. So my mom
Yeah.
she was a special ed teacher for several years. So
Okay.
she was able to teach in a way that I wasn't able to teach. So, but the other thing that worked really well with this one son was reading eggs, for example, because
Yeah.
that was a very visual and it provided him a tactile activity to do because he's playing a video game. And my kids, sorry, but my kids love video games and they always
Yeah.
have. Sorry that I passed that on to you kids. But
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
but it provided multiple ways for him to grasp the concept of phonics and words. For him, that worked really well. Other kids
Yeah.
didn't work as well. Like we had to
Yeah.
do straight up reading in books. So I
Yeah.
agree with you that there's just so many ways that we can provide a learning
Mm-hmm.
for our kids that it's
Mm-hmm.
important for us to pay attention. And then, okay,
Mm-hmm.
don't just stubbornly think we know the answer because we have to keep trying.
True. And I think your idea of the shape of the word, like there is some phonics programs that have taught that even
Mm,
as a thing. And again, I wouldn't say that's awful and terrible. There's a place to say this shape of this word, okay, you need to know this word because let's say it's your name, right?
mm,
These are really important, and so I'm gonna find a way to help you learn this word, and maybe we have to put boxes around it to sort of so you can always see this and know this. So there are going to be some places and some times for that. But yeah, absolutely, using as many modalities, and you just proved that. What else do I do with this child because I'm struggling? What other kind of modality can we use? So many people, like for instance, how to read in 100 easy lessons, right? Teach your child to read. Like people have told me, like I used that book and it worked amazing for my first child, and so I'm just a proponent of it. It works great until I came to my fourth child. It didn't work at all.
yeah.
Right. And so I think that's where we have to be flexible as parents to say, this child just learns things differently. And how do we help them? Because in the end, we want them to understand how they learn. And
Right.
that should be the whole point of us understanding their learning styles is how are we going to learn something new when we head off to college or we're on a new job and we have to memorize this whole list of things at this new job? How is your child going to memorize this list? They have to know what's going to work for them. And you, as a mom, I think, are responsible to help them discover that with them.
Yep.
The detective to say, okay, well, let's try this. Because I've had it where students in my therapy practice would they have to memorize keywords and sounds to go with them. And I'll say, what's your strategy? And they'll say, well, I just look at them and say them really fast and then I remember them. I said, okay. So they come back, how's your list? Oh, I don't remember my list. Well, how did that strategy work for you? Well, that's just how I do it. Well, I don't think your strategy is working.
Yeah.
Right. So helping them discover, well, what's another strategy? What if we made a story with those words? What if we drew a picture with those words? What if we walked around and jumped while we said those words? Let's try these things.
I think it's too easy to think of this as just a kid thing because that's what
Oh,
we're, but grown-ups need these clues, and we need to understand ourselves too. Like, I know if it's something really important that I need to write it down, right? For me, that's what I know I need to do. Or if I'm trying to learn something, I need to watch the video and then write a note or try doing it or something. And my husband, for example, he will watch YouTube videos up close and personal and then go do the thing because he's a very tactile, hands-on guy. He likes to figure things out for himself. Like he wants to build his own computer. Okay, he built his own computer. Whereas other people won't want to do that because they need to have instructions the entire way. But he was able to figure out where things go because he just understands how things work together. And it's really interesting seeing as grown-ups how we all learn as well. It's funny
yeah.
because we do so often think learning styles and learning is just for kids, but I liked your idea of just making sure you're paying attention to what strategies work for you, even as a grown up. That's important.
For sure. And I notice, like, when you say I need to write it down, my question to you is, and do you read it again? Or is the act of writing it down enough to make the connection in your mind? And for lots of us, like, I write things down too. I was just in a meeting and I'm taking notes. I may never look at those notes again, but I know that the act of moving my hand is helping my brain make the connections so that I can recall it. And I think that's what we want for our kids to say, how are you going to learn this best? Now, for your husband, so he can watch it and remember it. That's an amazing skill, right? You and I might say, I need to also write it down. So I can watch it and that's helpful, but I also have to write.
Yeah. If I want to
So maybe,
remember it, I have to do something to make it stick in my head. Yeah.
yes. Maybe because my brain wanders. Maybe because I'm already thinking about what else is for dinner. Maybe that thought has come in and I have to tune that out in order to hold this thought. No, I love it. I love the concept of how do we learn best. And, my takeaway, my most summary is we need a lot of modalities together. And if you have to think about this, if there's an emergency, right? What are you going to do? How are you going to help this child be safe? Right?
Mm.
Are you going to scream out a whole list of instructions? Are you like, what are you going to do to help them see? Are you going to go give them some actions? What are you going to do besides lift them up and move them out of the way? But, thinking about if I had to get information into them right now that their life depended on, how would they learn it best?
Good question.
And I think as we do that, we can also see that any of us would learn best with as many modalities as possible, right? And we now know that then, at least if you have a group of kids, if you use a lot of the modalities, you're going to catch most of them.
Yeah.
Right, in that concept.
All right. So just a couple last questions here. Do you have any resources for anybody who might be wanting to learn more?
Yeah, I love, there's a couple. One's called Teaching with the Brain in Mind by Eric Jensen. Another excellent book is called by David Sousa, Sousa, who writes a book on how the brain learns. And then Jane Healy, who's written, and some of her stuff's a little older, but she talks about, her one book that I love is called Different Learners. And, she just talks about how we learn differently and how different people take in information differently. So I think those probably are my most favorite. The other one that's, again, older, so it is a bit not with the newer technology, is Smart Moves by Carla Hannaford, who writes Why Learning is Not All in Your Head. And in there, she talks a lot about movement and connections and what, that learning is not just an auditory thinking, but that we need these other pieces in order to learn information.
All right. So where can my listeners find out more information about you and how to contact you and if they have any questions or need some
Sure.
help?
Yeah, I do homeschool consultations mostly for parents of students or kiddos with exceptional needs, unique needs. Of course, really, that's all of us, probably. But they can find me at geerlinkslearning.com. And my website is Geerlinks Educational Therapy. But yeah, on there's a spot for you to book a consultation. There's a free consultation you can connect with, as well as more screening. We can talk about when we do assessment or screening assessments, that really helps us also see how they learn auditorily or visually, etc. And I think sometimes that helps. Like sometimes we just don't know. And so when we do an auditory screening, we can say, yeah, they're not following. When there's a sound in both ears, they can't decipher which ear it's even in, or they don't hear both words. So then we can help you in your discernment of, is this an auditory or is this a visual learner? And we do that with the visual testing and processing test as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking some time and chatting with me today. It's been really cool chatting with you and talking about learning styles, or the new version of it called modalities.
Yes.
Something I'm learning here. And I appreciate your time.
No problem. It's always a pleasure. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast. We hope our conversation about learning styles gives you some new insight into how your child learns. In the next episode, we're going to be chatting with Courtney Riddell from Little Monkey Entertainment about adding drama and theater to your homeschool day. If you have any questions, feedback, ideas for topics, or people we should connect with, please let us know. And don't forget to share with your homeschooling friends. Thanks so much for joining in. Until next time, happy learning.